Hi, I'm Alice, and this is the story of how my life turned upside down, twice. I guess it's best to start at the beginning. I was born to loving parents, David and Grace Lawson, in a small suburban town. Dad was a journalist, and Mom worked as a nurse. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Life was pretty normal until I turned 12. That's when everything changed. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, and my parents were driving home from a dinner party. I was at home with my grandma, watching some silly cartoon, when the phone rang. I'll never forget the chill that ran down my spine when I heard my grandma's muffled sobs from the kitchen. The next few days were a blur. They told us Mom had died on impact. Dad survived, but barely. When I finally saw him in the hospital, he was a shell of the man I knew. His legs were crushed, and the doctor said he'd never walk again. "Alice," he croaked, reaching for my hand. "I'm so sorry, sweetie. I'm so sorry." At the time, I didn't understand why he was apologizing. It wasn't his fault. A drunk driver had plowed into their car. But as I grew older, I realized he was sorry for what our lives had become, for the struggles we'd face, for the mother I'd lost, and for the father he thought he could no longer be. But my dad, David Lawson, was stronger than he gave himself credit for. Once he was out of the hospital and settled into his wheelchair, he threw himself into his work. He'd always been a talented writer, and now he channeled all his energy into his job as an editor at the city's major newspaper. As I entered my teens, Dad made sure I had everything I needed. He encouraged me to join clubs, make friends, and have as normal a life as possible. But the truth was, I preferred spending time with him. We'd watch old movies together, argue about books, and he'd help me with my homework. When it came time for college, Dad insisted I go away to school. "You need to spread your wings, kiddo," he said. "Don't worry about me, I'll be fine." I was hesitant, but I knew he was right. So, off I went to State University, majoring in accounting. It was there that I met Jessica, who would become my best friend. Through her, I met her second cousin, Trevor. Trevor was kind and funny, and he didn't flinch when I told him about my dad. In fact, when he met Dad for the first time, they hit it off immediately, bonding over their shared love of classic rock. "Your old man's cool," Trevor told me later. "And you're pretty amazing for taking care of him all these years." I shrugged it off, but inside, I was glowing. For the first time since the accident, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could have a normal life. A life with love, laughter, and yes, even a family of my own someday. After graduation, life seemed to fall into place, like pieces of a puzzle. I landed a job at the local tax service, and Trevor began working as a long-haul truck driver. We dated for 2 years before he proposed on a crisp autumn evening in the park where we had our first date. I was over the moon, but there was one thing I needed to make clear. "Yes, Trevor, but I can't leave my dad. He needs me." Trevor's face lit up with a wide grin. "I wouldn't have it any other way. We'll all live together. Your dad's apartment is big enough for the 3 of us, right?" The wedding was small but beautiful. Dad insisted on wheeling himself down the aisle to give me away. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. As I stood there, hand in hand with Trevor, I felt like I was living a fairy tale. But every fairy tale has its villains, and mine came in the form of my mother-in-law, Sophia, and sister-in-law, Rose. From the moment I met them, I could tell they didn't approve of me. "So, your father is handicapped?" Sophia asked during our first meeting, her nose wrinkling as if she smelled something unpleasant. "He's disabled," I corrected, trying to keep my tone neutral. "But he works as an editor." "How nice," she interrupted, clearly uninterested. "Trevor, darling, are you sure about this? There are so many nice girls from good families." I felt my face flush with anger and shame, but Trevor, bless him, immediately jumped to my defense. Mom, Alice is from a good family. Her dad's disability doesn't change that. I love her, and that's all that matters. That shut Sophia up, but I could see the disapproval lingering in her eyes. Rose, taking cues from her mother, was equally cold toward me. After the wedding, true to his word, Trevor moved in with Dad and me. Our life settled into a comfortable routine. I'd go to work at the tax office, Trevor would be on the road for days at a time, and when he was home, we'd all have dinner together. But whenever Sophia and Rose visited, the atmosphere in our home changed. They'd strut around like they owned the place, barely acknowledging Dad's presence. Once, I overheard Sophia muttering to Rose, "It's a shame. Trevor could have done so much better. Now he's stuck with this girl and her crippled father. What if they have children? Can you imagine the genes?" I was furious, but I bit my tongue for Trevor's sake. I tried to keep the peace, but it was becoming harder and harder. One evening, after a particularly tense visit from Sophia and Rose, I broke down in tears. Trevor found me in our bedroom, sobbing. Hey, he said, pulling me into his arms. "What's wrong?" "Your mom and sister," I hiccuped. "They hate me. They think I'm not good enough for you because of Dad." Trevor's face hardened. "That's ridiculous. You and your dad are my family now. If they can't accept that, it's their problem, not ours." Trevor's words comforted me, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of our troubles with Sophia and Rose. As the months passed, Trevor's trucking business took off. He was always on the road, crisscrossing the country in his big rig. I missed him terribly when he was gone, but I threw myself into my work at the tax office and spent my evenings keeping Dad company. One crisp autumn evening, as I was helping Dad into bed, Trevor called. His voice crackled with excitement over the phone. "Alice, I've been thinking," he said. "How would you feel about buying a townhouse? It would be easier for your dad to move around in a wheelchair. He could spend more time outside, and you could have a garden, something to keep you busy while I'm on the road." The more he talked, the more I warmed to the idea. I glanced at Dad, who was pretending not to eavesdrop. "What do you think, Dad?" I asked, putting the phone on speaker. Dad's eyes lit up. "A garden would be nice," he admitted. "And it would be easier to get outside." That settled it. Over the next few weeks, we threw ourselves into house hunting. We finally found the perfect place, a spacious townhouse with wide doorways, a roll-in shower for Dad, and a beautiful backyard. Taking out a mortgage was daunting, but with Trevor's income, mine, and the rent from Dad's old apartment, we managed to make it work. We moved in on a sunny Saturday in spring, and I'll never forget the look on Dad's face as he wheeled himself out onto our new patio. "This is perfect, sweetie," he said, his eyes misty. "Thank you." The next few months were spent settling in and making the place our own. I planted a small vegetable garden, and Dad would sit outside for hours, soaking up the sun and fresh air. It was idyllic. Then came the housewarming party. We invited friends, colleagues, and yes, Sophia and Rose. The party was in full swing when they arrived, fashionably late as usual. They sauntered in, eyeing everything with barely concealed envy. As we moved through the house, I could see the wheels turning in Sophia's head. When we reached the master bedroom, she turned to me with a sly smile. "You know, Alice," she said in a low voice, "this would be perfect for Trevor and me. Why don't you send your father to a nursing home? Then I could move in here." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Excuse me." "Oh, don't look so shocked," Sophia continued. "Your father isn't well. He's not a whole person anymore, is he? He doesn't need all this luxury." A nursing home would be more than enough for someone in his condition. Before I could respond, Sophia marched out to the patio, where Dad was chatting with some guests. To my horror, she grabbed the handles of his wheelchair and started pushing him towards the driveway. "Sophia!" I shouted, running after her. "What are you doing?" "If he won't go to a nursing home, he can stay outside," Sophia sneered. "Isn't that what you wanted, for him to be outdoors?" I stood there, shaking with rage and disbelief. Thankfully, Trevor heard the commotion and came running. His face flushed with anger as he took in the scene. "Mom," he bellowed. "What the hell are you doing? Let go of David's chair right now." Sophia looked stunned at Trevor's tone. "But honey, I was just—" "I don't want to hear it," Trevor cut her off. "You and Rose need to leave. Now." After they left, Trevor apologized profusely to both Dad and me. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I had no idea she would do something like that. I'm just so sorry." Dad reached out and patted Trevor's hand gently. "It's not your fault, son. Some people just can't understand." Life settled into a new rhythm after the housewarming incident. Sophia and Rose kept their distance, which suited me just fine. Trevor threw himself into his work, taking on more long-haul routes to help cover the mortgage, while I split my time between my job at the tax office and tending to our home and Dad. 2 years passed in the blink of an eye, and our life fell into a comfortable routine. Trevor was on the road more often than not, but when he was home, our little family was happy. Dad's health remained stable, and he seemed content spending his days in the garden or working on his editing from home. Then came the call that shattered my world. I was at work when my phone rang. An unfamiliar male voice greeted me. "Mrs. Parker, this is Officer Rodriguez from the Highway Patrol." My heart dropped into my stomach. "Yes." I managed to squeak out. "I'm sorry to inform you that your husband, Trevor Parker, has been in a serious accident." The rest of the conversation became a blur. Words like head-on collision and didn't make it floated around me, but I couldn't process them. It wasn't until I heard myself thanking the officer and hanging up that the reality began to sink in. Trevor was gone. The next week passed in a haze of grief and disbelief. I moved through the motions of planning the funeral like a robot, barely able to comprehend what was happening. The day before the funeral, I steeled myself and made the call to Sophia. I felt she deserved to hear about her son's death from me, not from a newspaper obituary. "Hello." Sophia's sharp voice answered. "Sophia, it's Alice," I said, my voice trembling. It's about Trevor. He's gone. There was an accident." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, to my shock, Sophia's voice came back, dripping with venom. "This is your fault," she hissed. "You forced him to work so hard, driving that truck to pay for your fancy house. You killed my son." I was stunned. "Sophia, Save it," she snapped. "I expect you to give him the best funeral money can buy, but don't expect a penny from us. You made your bed, now lie in it." The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, tears streaming down my face. How could she be so cruel? How could she blame me for this? The day of Trevor's funeral dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. The church was packed. Trevor had been well liked in the community. It seemed like half the town had turned out to pay their respects. After the service, as people filed past to offer their condolences, I couldn't help but notice the absence of Trevor's mother and sister. They hadn't even bothered to show up to their own son and brother's funeral. Dad reached out and squeezed my hand. "Their loss, sweetie. We're family, and we'll get through this together," he said softly. As we pulled into our driveway, something felt off. The lights were on inside the house, which was strange because I was certain I had turned everything off before we left. "Did you leave any lights on, Dad?" I asked, frowning. He shook his head. "No, I don't think so." As we got closer, I saw movement inside the house. My heart started racing. Were we being robbed? And on the day of Trevor's funeral, no less. I helped Dad out of the car and into his wheelchair, my mind spinning. Should I call the police? But as we approached the front door, I heard familiar voices inside. My blood ran cold as I recognized them. I pushed open the door to find Sophia and Rose in our living room, surrounded by boxes and pieces of furniture. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, my grief momentarily forgotten in the face of this outrageous intrusion. Sophia turned to me, her face a mask of false sympathy. "Oh, Alice dear, we're just helping you pack up. After all, you can't possibly afford to keep this place now that Trevor's gone." I was speechless. Rose chimed in with her sickeningly sweet voice, "Don't worry, you can go back to your father's apartment. It's cozy." I could feel the rage building inside me. "Get out," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my house right now." Sophia had the audacity to look offended. "This house belongs to us now. All of Trevor's property does. We're his family, after all." "Like hell you are." I exploded. "Where were you today?" "At his funeral." "Oh, that's right, you couldn't be bothered to show up." Sophia waved her hand dismissively. "We were busy making arrangements. Now, be a good girl and start packing. We'll have you out by tomorrow." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These women hadn't shed a tear for Trevor, hadn't even attended his funeral, and now they were trying to kick us out of our home. "I'm calling the police," I said, pulling out my phone. Sophia and Rose exchanged worried glances. They clearly hadn't expected me to fight back. "Now, Alice," Sophia began, but I cut her off. "No. You have exactly 5 minutes to get out of my house before I call the cops. This is my home. Trevor and I bought it together. You have no right to be here." Maybe it was the steel in my voice or the fire in my eyes, but Sophia and Rose finally seemed to realize they had gone too far. They gathered their things and left, but not before Sophia turned to me with a sneer. "This isn't over, Alice. You'll be hearing from our lawyers." The days following Trevor's funeral were a blur of grief, anxiety, and paperwork. I threw myself into sorting out Trevor's affairs, partly to keep busy and partly out of fear that Sophia and Rose would try to swoop in and take what wasn't theirs. A week after the funeral, I received a call from a local law firm. My heart raced as I answered, fearing it was Sophia making good on her threat of legal action. "Mrs. Parker?" a crisp, professional voice asked. "This is Tom Anderson from Anderson and Partners. I'm calling regarding your late husband's will." A glimmer of hope flickered inside me. His will. I didn't even know he had one. "Yes, ma'am," Mr. Anderson continued. "Mr. Parker came to see us about 6 months ago. He asked that we contact you in the event of his passing." I scheduled an appointment for the next day, my mind reeling. Why hadn't Trevor told me about this? What did it mean? The next morning, I wheeled Dad into Mr. Anderson's office. The lawyer greeted us warmly, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Mrs. Parker, Mr. Lawson, thank you for coming in," he said, gesturing for us to settle near his desk. "I'm sorry for your loss." Mr. Anderson opened a file on his desk. "Now, as I mentioned on the phone, your husband came to see us to draft his will. He was very clear about his wishes." I held my breath as Mr. Anderson began to read. I, Trevor Parker, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions to my beloved wife, Alice Parker. I gasped, and Dad's grip on my hand tightened. Mr. Anderson continued, this includes our home, my truck, and all our savings. It is my wish that Alice uses these resources to care for herself and her father, David Lawson, whom I have come to love as my own. Tears streamed down my face. Even from beyond the grave, Trevor was still taking care of us. There's more, Mr. Anderson said gently. Mr. Parker left a letter for you. He handed me an envelope, and with shaking hands, I opened it and began to read. My dearest Alice. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm so sorry for leaving you and David. Please know that you two were the best thing that ever happened to me. I made this will because I know how my mother and sister can be. I didn't want to worry you, but I needed to make sure you and David were protected if anything happened to me. You're my real family, Alice, you and David, not them. Take care of each other, live your lives to the fullest, and know that I'll always be watching over you. All my love. Trevor. I clutched the letter to my chest, sobbing. Dad was crying too, his weathered hand gently patting my arm. Mr. Anderson gave us a moment before speaking again. Mrs. Parker, there's one more thing. Your husband's truck was insured. Given the circumstances of the accident, the insurance company will be paying out the full value of the policy. I looked up, sniffling. What does that mean? It means, Mr. Anderson said with a small smile, that you'll be receiving a substantial sum, enough to pay off your mortgage, and then some. As we left the lawyer's office, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. We were going to be okay, Trevor had made sure of it. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed a familiar car parked on the street. My heart sank as I recognized Sophia's sleek sedan. Oh no, I muttered. What now? Sure enough, Sophia and Rose were waiting on the front porch. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I had Trevor's letter in my pocket and the strength of his love in my heart. Alice, Sophia began as we approached, her voice sickly sweet. We need to talk about Trevor's estate. I stood tall, looking her straight in the eye. No, Sophia, we don't. Trevor left everything to me. It's all legal and official. Do you want to know why? Because we were his real family, not you. Now please leave, you're trespassing on my property. For once, Sophia was speechless. Rose tugged at her arm, whispering urgently. With one last venomous glare, they got into their car and drove away. The weeks following our meeting with the lawyer were a whirlwind of activity. I threw myself into settling Trevor's affairs, grateful for the distraction from my grief. The insurance payout came through, and true to Mr. Anderson's word, it was enough to pay off the mortgage with plenty left over. One afternoon, as I was going through Trevor's desk, I came across a small notebook. Curious, I opened it and found pages filled with his messy scrawl. It was a journal, filled with his thoughts and plans for our future. Thinking about starting a college fund for our future kids, one entry read. Want to make sure they have the best start in life. My heart clenched. We had talked about having children someday but had decided to wait until we were more financially stable. Now, reading Trevor's private hopes and dreams, I felt a fresh wave of grief wash over me. Oh, Trevor, I whispered, clutching the notebook to my chest. We had so many plans. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. My mind kept drifting to the journal, to the future we'd never have. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of Trevor. He was smiling, holding out his hand to me. It's okay, Alice, he said in my dream. Everything's going to be all right. I woke up the next morning feeling different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something had changed. As I got ready for work, a wave of nausea hit me, and I barely made it to the bathroom in time. Over the next few days, the morning sickness persisted. At first, I chalked it up to stress and grief, but a small voice in the back of my mind whispered another possibility. Finally, after a week of this, I found myself standing in the pharmacy aisle, staring at pregnancy tests with trembling hands. I bought one and hurried home. The 3 minutes I waited for the result felt like the longest of my life. When I finally looked at the test, I saw 2 clear blue lines. I sank to the bathroom floor, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions: joy, fear, grief, hope, all swirling together in a dizzying cocktail. "Alice?" Dad's voice came through the door. "Everything okay in there?" I opened the door, tears streaming down my face. His expression shifted instantly from concern to alarm. "What's wrong, sweetie?" he asked. I held up the test, my hand trembling. "I'm pregnant, Dad." I collapsed into his arms, sobbing. He held me, stroking my hair like he used to when I was a little girl. "It's okay," he murmured. "It's going to be okay. You're not alone, Alice. And this baby is a gift, a piece of Trevor that will live on." His words struck a deep chord within me. This baby was a part of Trevor, a continuation of our love. The fear that had gripped me began to recede, replaced by a fierce determination. "You're right," I said, wiping my eyes. "This baby is a gift, and we're going to be okay." Dad smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's my girl. Now let's get you something to eat. You're eating for 2 now, after all." As we made our way to the kitchen, I felt a sense of hope blooming in my chest. The road ahead would be challenging, but with my father by my side and Trevor's child growing inside me, I knew we could face anything. As my belly grew with our child, I found strength I never knew I had. Dad was my rock, always there with a kind word or a helping hand. We settled into a new routine, just the 2 of us, eagerly anticipating the arrival of the newest member of our little family. One sunny afternoon, as I was tending to the garden Dad and I had planted together, I heard a car pull up. My heart sank as I recognized Sophia's sedan. What could they possibly want now? I made my way to the front of the house, one hand instinctively cradling my swollen belly. Sophia and Rose stood on our porch, looking uncomfortable and slightly desperate. "Alice," Sophia began, her voice lacking its usual sharpness, we need to talk to you." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Rose chimed in, her eyes darting around nervously. "We've hit some hard times," she stammered. "We were wondering if we could stay in your father's old apartment, just until we get back on our feet." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything they'd put us through, they had the audacity to ask for more. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice firm but calm. "That's not possible. I don't want to communicate with you anymore." Sophia's eyes narrowed as they fell on my pregnant belly. Her face twisted with a mix of shock and disgust. "You're pregnant," she spat. "Already? You little prostitute. I can't believe you've already found a new man. Trevor's body isn't even cold in the ground." A surge of anger welled up inside me, but I pushed it down. I didn't want to explain that it was Trevor's child. I didn't want my baby to have such a grandmother and aunt. Instead, I smiled a small, secretive smile that seemed to unnerve Sophia even more. "My personal life is none of your concern," I said calmly. "Now I think it's time for you to leave." Sophia looked like she wanted to say more, but something in my expression must have stopped her. She turned on her heel, grabbing Rose's arm, and I watched as they drove away, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. I had stood my ground, protected my family, and maintained my dignity. Trevor would have been proud.